The autumn morning mist clung to the windows of Precision Elite Shooting Club as Sarah Martinez adjusted her worn denim jacket and stepped through the imposing glass doors. At 42, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her weathered hands speaking of years spent working honest jobs. To the designer-clad clientele scattered throughout the marble lobby, she might as well have been invisible. The club's interior screamed exclusivity, from the crystal chandelier casting prismatic light across Italian marble floors to the mahogany walls lined with photographs of champions, politicians, and celebrities. This wasn't a place for people like Sarah Martinez, a night shift janitor at the local hospital who cleaned up after others while they slept peacefully in their beds. But Sarah wasn't here by accident. 3 weeks ago, she'd witnessed something that had shattered her quiet world. Through the hospital's security office window, where she'd been emptying trash bins, she'd seen footage that made her blood run cold. The city's police chief, Marcus Kellerman, meeting secretly with Vincent Ashworth, owner of Precision Elite, and a man whose political connections ran deeper than most people realized. Money had changed hands, along with what appeared to be official documents. When Sarah had tried to report what she'd seen, she'd been told to mind her own business by officers who seemed more interested in protecting the powerful than serving justice. The dismissal had stung, but it hadn't surprised her. She'd learned long ago that ordinary people were expected to keep their heads down and their mouths shut when witnessing the sins of their betters. But Sarah Martinez wasn't ordinary, though she'd spent the last 15 years ensuring that no one would ever suspect the truth about her past. The registration desk was manned by a young woman whose manicured nails clicked impatiently against her tablet as Sarah approached. The nameplate read, Madison, and her expression shifted from bored indifference to barely concealed disdain as she took in Sarah's appearance. The faded jeans, the discount store sweater, the scuffed boots that had seen better years. Madison's mental calculation was swift and merciless, placing Sarah firmly in the category of people who didn't belong in this rarefied atmosphere. Roberto had often said that the most dangerous enemy was the one you never saw coming, the quiet professional who let you underestimate them until it was too late. 23 years of active duty had taught Sarah to read people quickly, to assess threats and opportunities in split seconds. She'd walked away from that life, buried it so deeply that even she sometimes forgot the woman she'd once been. First Sergeant Sarah Martinez, whose confirmed kills in Afghanistan had earned her commendations that remained classified, whose steady hands had saved countless American lives from distances that most people couldn't even imagine. Her husband Roberto had died in Kandahar, his last letter speaking of coming home to build something better together. She'd left the military after his death, unable to continue serving a system that she'd begun to see as corrupted by the very people it was meant to protect. The transition to civilian life had been brutal, her specialized skills worthless in a world that valued conformity over competence. She'd taken the hospital job because it offered solitude and anonymity, because it allowed her to fade into the background where powerful men couldn't use her for their own purposes. But watching Kellerman and Ashworth conduct their corrupt business had awakened something in her that 15 years of civilian life hadn't quite managed to kill. "Excuse me," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a steadiness that belied her humble appearance. "I'd like to register for today's open competition." She placed a completed application form on the counter, along with the entry fee she'd saved from 3 months of skipped lunches and walk-to-work days. Madison's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise, as if Sarah had just announced her intention to sprout wings and fly. The open competition was a monthly event that drew serious shooters from across 3 states, men and women who treated their weapons like surgeons treated their scalpels. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion," Madison said, her tone dripping with condescension. "This isn't a beginner's class. The open competition requires significant experience and specialized equipment Perhaps you'd be more interested in our basic safety course? She gestured toward a small poster advertising introductory lessons, the kind designed for suburban housewives who wanted to feel empowered for an afternoon. Sarah's eyes never left Madison's face, though something flickered in their depths, a flash of steel beneath still waters. Before Sarah could respond, a commanding voice cut through their exchange. "Is there a problem here?" Vincent Ashworth himself approached, his 6'3" frame cutting an imposing figure in his tailored shooting jacket. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his handshake firm enough to crack bones, his smile as sharp as broken glass. Everything about him projected power and authority, from his custom Italian leather holster to the Rolex that caught the morning light. At 55, he'd built an empire that extended far beyond this shooting club. Madison quickly explained the situation, her voice taking on the eager tone of someone seeking approval from a superior. Ashworth's eyes swept over Sarah with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential prey. "Mrs." Ashworth paused, waiting for Sarah to fill in the blank, his tone suggesting she should be grateful for his attention. "Martinez." Sarah replied simply, offering neither explanation nor apology for her presence. Ashworth nodded slowly, his mind already calculating how to handle this minor disruption to his perfectly ordered world. The open competition was more than just a shooting contest. It was a networking event where deals were made, where his influence was displayed for potential clients and political allies. Having some random housewife making a fool of herself would reflect poorly on the club's reputation. Around them, other club members had begun to take notice, their conversations dropping to whispered observations about the woman who clearly didn't belong among the elite. Sarah felt their stares like physical weight, but she'd endured far worse scrutiny in far more dangerous circumstances. The mountains of Afghanistan had taught her patience and preparation, always trumped arrogance and assumption. "Mrs. Martinez, I admire your enthusiasm, but this competition isn't really appropriate for someone of your..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Background. The equipment alone costs more than most people make in a month. Perhaps Madison could arrange a private lesson with one of our instructors? On the house?" Of course. His offer was delivered with the patronizing smile of a man accustomed to having his generosity accepted without question. Sarah's response was quiet but unwavering. "I have the entry fee, and I meet the stated qualifications. The club's website says all participants must demonstrate safe weapon handling and basic marksmanship. I can do both." She reached into her worn purse and pulled out a faded certificate, her civilian marksmanship qualification from the local range where she'd been quietly practicing for months. It wasn't impressive by any objective standard, just barely meeting the minimum requirements. But it was legitimate. Ashworth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he realized she'd done her homework, that dismissing her outright might create the kind of scene that attracted unwanted attention. The moment stretched between them, a silent battle of wills that drew curious glances from the gathering crowd. In the background, the morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like memories of battles fought in distant mountains. Sarah thought of Roberto, whose death had stripped away her illusions about honor and service in a world increasingly dominated by men like Ashworth. She thought of the corruption she'd witnessed, the casual betrayal of public trust by individuals who'd never worn a uniform or risked anything more dangerous than a stock portfolio. Most of all, she thought of the promise she'd made over Roberto's grave, to never again stand silent while powerful men trampled on the principles he'd died defending. The equipment room at Precision Elite resembled a high-end gun store more than a typical range facility, with glass cases displaying custom firearms that cost more than most people's cars. Sarah was issued a standard competition rifle, a quality instrument but nothing compared to the personalized weapons being assembled by her fellow competitors. She accepted it without complaint, running her hands over the stock and barrel with a familiarity that might have surprised anyone paying attention. But no one was paying attention. To them, she was already a footnote in today's entertainment, someone to be pitied rather than watched. The rifle felt strange in her hands after so many years away from professional-grade equipment, but muscle memory began to reassert itself as she performed the basic function checks that had been drilled into her during countless training sessions. The weight distribution was different from her old service weapon, the trigger pull slightly heavier. But these were adjustments any professional could make. Marcus Kellerman arrived, just as the competition was beginning. His police chief's uniform traded for expensive civilian shooting attire that did nothing to diminish his aura of authority. At 48, he carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. His crew cut still sharp, despite the gray threads beginning to show. His partnership with Ashworth had been profitable for both men, city contracts flowing toward Ashworth's various enterprises, while political support flowed back to Kellerman's expanding budget. They greeted each other with the easy familiarity of longtime business partners, their handshake lasting just long enough to pass a small envelope from Kellerman's pocket to Ashworth's. Sarah watched this exchange from across the room, her janitor's training in invisibility serving her well as she observed the casual corruption playing out in broad daylight. These men believed themselves untouchable, protected by their positions and the complicity of a system designed to serve their interests. The competition format was traditional, but challenging. Precision shooting at increasing distances, starting at 100 yards and progressing to 500 yards in the final round. Each shooter would be scored on accuracy and consistency, with the lowest performers eliminated after each stage. Sarah drew lane 15. Far from the prime central positions claimed by the regulars, where spectators would be less likely to observe her technique, it was perfect positioning for someone who preferred to remain unnoticed until the moment of truth arrived. As the first round commenced, Sarah's fellow competitors displayed the confidence that came with expensive equipment and years of practice. Their shots grouped tightly around the target centers, scores that would be impressive at any civilian range. Sarah approached her turn with the careful deliberation of someone supposedly unfamiliar with competitive pressure, taking longer than necessary to adjust her position and sight picture. Her first shot struck the outer ring of the target, drawing a few sympathetic murmurs from the watching crowd. What they couldn't see was the mental calculation happening behind Sarah's calm exterior. Every shot was deliberate, every miss carefully placed to maintain her cover while she assessed the competition. The equipment, and most importantly, the growing overconfidence of her targets. She'd learned patience in the mountains of Afghanistan, where a single poorly timed shot could compromise an entire mission. This required similar discipline, similar faith that preparation and precision would ultimately triumph over arrogance. Ashworth observed from the elevated viewing area, his satisfaction evident as Sarah's early shots confirmed his assessment of her abilities. This was playing out exactly as he'd expected, providing gentle entertainment while reinforcing the natural order of things. Kellerman stood beside him, their conversation quiet but animated, discussing upcoming city contracts and political maneuvering with the casual ease of men who viewed public service as a pathway to private profit. By the third round, half the original field had been eliminated, leaving 12 shooters to compete at the 300-yard distance. Sarah had advanced through a combination of steady improvement and fortunate eliminations, her scores placing her solidly in the middle of the pack. Good enough to continue, not good enough to attract serious attention. She'd reached the point where her strategy would need to evolve, where maintaining her cover might require revealing more of her true capabilities. The 300-yard targets presented a significant challenge for civilian shooters, requiring skills that went beyond basic marksmanship into the realm of serious technical competence. Wind conditions became a factor, as did the ability to read environmental conditions and adjust accordingly. Sarah watched as several competitors struggled with these challenges, their expensive equipment unable to compensate for gaps in fundamental knowledge. When her turn came, she allowed herself to demonstrate competence that bordered on proficiency. Kellerman noticed her improvement, his attention finally drawn to the woman he'd dismissed earlier. "Who is that in lane 15?" he asked Ashworth, pointing towards Sarah as she completed her string of shots. Ashworth consulted his clipboard, frowning slightly as he read her registration information. Some cleaning lady named Martinez. Met the minimum qualifications but clearly in over her head. Though she seems to be improving as the day goes on. There was a note of curiosity in his voice now, the first crack in his confident dismissal of her presence. Around them, other spectators had begun to take notice of the unlikely competitor who continued to advance against much more experienced opposition. Conversations carried undertones of speculation and growing interest in the woman who seemed to be exceeding everyone's expectations, including possibly her own. The fourth round would be shot at 400 yards, a distance that separated serious shooters from weekend enthusiasts. Only 8 competitors remained, and Sarah found herself grouped with individuals whose equipment and technique marked them as genuine experts. Her continued presence had begun to generate whispered conversations among the spectators, many of whom were asking the same questions that had occurred to Kellerman. Who was this woman, and how was she consistently advancing? Sarah's performance in the fourth round answered some questions while raising others. Her shots struck with precision that could no longer be attributed to beginner's luck, grouping in patterns that demonstrated understanding of ballistics and environmental factors. She was clearly holding back, shooting well enough to advance, but not so well as to dominate. The realization that she might be deliberately controlling her performance sent a ripple of unease through the watching crowd. This wasn't the story they'd expected to witness, the comfortable narrative of ambition meeting reality. Instead, they were watching something far more complex and potentially threatening to their assumptions about natural hierarchies and appropriate places. As preparations began for the final round at 500 yards, only 4 shooters remained. Sarah, 2 local champions with multiple competition victories, and Marcus Kellerman himself. The police chief had advanced through solid, professional shooting that reflected his law enforcement training and regular practice. He'd expected to face familiar opponents in this final group, men whose abilities he knew and respected. The presence of the mysterious woman from lane 15 had transformed what should have been a predictable conclusion. Ashworth found himself in an uncomfortable position, caught between his desire to see Sarah fail and his growing realization that she might be capable of genuine success. A victory by the cleaning lady would reflect poorly on his club's reputation, suggesting that their exclusive membership and premium services weren't actually superior to whatever training she'd received elsewhere. More troubling was the possibility that her success might encourage other undesirable participants to seek entry to future competitions. The final round would consist of 5 shots, each at 500 yards, with the highest total score determining the champion. Environmental conditions had shifted throughout the day, with variable winds and changing light creating challenges that would test even experienced shooters. Sarah approached her final shooting position with the same careful deliberation she'd maintained throughout the competition. But now something had changed in her bearing. The careful hesitation was gone, replaced by a confidence that spoke of deep familiarity. For the first time all day, Sarah allowed herself to remember who she'd been before becoming invisible. She thought of mountain peaks in Afghanistan where the wind never stopped, where shots had to be perfect because lives depended on them. She thought of Roberto's pride when she'd earned her advanced marksmanship qualifications, his jokes about being married to the most dangerous woman in their unit. When Sarah took her final shooting position, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere of Precision Elite. The woman who approached the firing line was no longer the hesitant amateur who'd struggled through the early rounds. This was someone who belonged here, whose movements carried the unconscious precision of thousands of hours of professional training, she settled into her shooting position with an economy of motion that spoke volumes to anyone with eyes to see. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm that every sniper learned but few truly mastered. The world narrowed to just her, the rifle, and the distant target that most people could barely see with the naked eye. Environmental factors became critical, requiring instant calculation and adjustment for wind speed, humidity, barometric pressure, and a dozen other variables that could turn a perfect shot into a complete miss. Her first shot at Lima Radis Yards struck dead center. A perfect bullseye that sent a shockwave through the watching crowd. The electronic scoring system confirmed what everyone had seen. A shot that would be difficult for anyone to match, let alone exceed. But it was her technique that truly captured attention, the way she'd made the difficult shot appear effortless, as if she were shooting at a target 10 feet away rather than 5 football fields distant. Murmurs rippled through the spectators as they began to realize they'd been watching something far more significant than a lucky amateur's unexpected success. Sarah's remaining 4 shots followed with mechanical precision, each one striking the target's center with such consistency that the electronic scoring system registered them as a perfect group. It was a performance that would have been remarkable from any shooter, but from someone who'd spent the entire day appearing to struggle with basic marksmanship, it was absolutely stunning. The crowd's murmurs had given way to stunned silence, then to excited conversations as people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Kellerman's face had gone ashen as he watched Sarah complete her perfect round, his own shooting suddenly feeling clumsy and inadequate by comparison. His best effort had produced a respectable but clearly inferior score, good enough for second place but nowhere near the standard she'd just established. Ashworth stood frozen in the viewing area, his mind racing through implications and consequences as he struggled to understand how his carefully controlled environment had been so thoroughly disrupted by a woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant. The natural order he'd spent decades cultivating had just been shattered by 5 perfect shots from someone who supposedly had no business competing at this level. The awards ceremony should have been a routine conclusion to another successful precision elite competition, but instead it felt like a reckoning. Sarah stood quietly as her name was announced as champion, accepting the congratulations of competitors who were still trying to understand how they'd been so completely outclassed. Her prize was a custom trophy and a cash award that represented more money than she typically earned in 3 months of night shifts. But the real victory was something far more valuable than any material reward. As photographers captured images of the unlikely champion, Sarah finally allowed herself to speak the words that would change everything. "I'd like to dedicate this victory to my late husband, Sergeant Roberto Martinez, who died serving his country in Afghanistan, and to all the honest public servants who deserve better than corrupt officials who sell their badges to the highest bidder." Her voice carried clearly through the sudden silence, each word falling like a hammer blow on the reputations of men who thought themselves untouchable. Kellerman stepped forward aggressively, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "That's a serious accusation. Mrs. Martinez, I hope you have evidence to support such claims, because slander carries serious legal consequences." But Sarah had faced more dangerous enemies than corrupt cops, had stared down insurgents who fought with weapons far more deadly than lawsuits and official harassment. Her response was delivered with the same calm precision that had characterized her shooting. "I have security camera footage of you accepting cash payments from Mr. Ashworth in the hospital parking garage 3 weeks ago. I have recorded conversations discussing city contracts and political favors. I have financial records showing suspicious payments from Ashworth's companies to your various bank accounts." Each revelation hit like a perfectly placed shot, destroying the foundations of Kellerman's seemingly unassailable position with surgical precision. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of camera phones recording every word for social media posterity. Ashworth's face had gone white as he realized the scope of his exposure. While Kellerman stood frozen between denial and damage control, Sarah continued with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. First Sergeant Sarah Martinez. Retired. Special Operations. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Some of you might remember the hospital security footage that disappeared after I tried to report what I'd seen. Fortunately, I'm better at making copies than some people are at covering their tracks. She looked directly at Kellerman as she spoke, her gaze steady and unforgiving. Roberto always said that the most dangerous enemy was the one you never saw coming. You never saw me at all. The words carried the weight of 15 years of buried anger, of watching corrupt officials profit while honest soldiers died defending principles. These men exploited for personal gain. The truth she'd carried in silence was finally free, delivered with the same precision that had characterized every aspect of her performance. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Justice finally served through the perfect aim of an invisible woman. Within minutes of Sarah's revelation, the exclusive atmosphere of Precision Elite had transformed into chaos. Club members, who moments before had been celebrating another successful competition, now huddled in small groups. Their voices hushed as they discussed the implications of what they'd just witnessed. Some were longtime associates of Ashworth, their own business dealings potentially compromised by association with his corruption. Others were simply wealthy socialites who suddenly found themselves uncomfortably close to a major scandal that would dominate local headlines for months to come. The immediate response from Kellerman and Ashworth was predictably defensive. Kellerman, drawing on decades of experience in damage control, attempted to regain command of the situation through intimidation. Mrs. Martinez, these are very serious allegations you're making in front of witnesses. I hope you've consulted with legal counsel because false accusations against public officials carry significant penalties. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to silencing inconvenient voices through official pressure. But Sarah had anticipated this response. She'd spent weeks preparing not just for the shooting competition, but for the legal and political battle that would inevitably follow her public accusations. Roberto had always said that the most successful military operations were those where every contingency had been considered and planned for in advance. Sarah's evidence wasn't limited to what she'd observed personally. Through careful investigation over the past 3 weeks, she'd uncovered a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond simple cash payments. Bank records obtained through a contact at the hospital's accounting department showed regular transfers from companies controlled by Ashworth to accounts linked to Kellerman. City contracts awarded to Ashworth's construction company had bypassed normal bidding procedures, often at prices significantly above market rates. Most damaging of all were the recorded phone conversations. Captured through equipment Sarah had purchased with her competition winnings fund, the recordings revealed conversations between Kellerman and Ashworth discussing specific city projects, with Ashworth providing detailed instructions on how contracts should be structured to benefit his companies, while Kellerman ensured regulatory oversight would be minimal. They'd grown careless over the years, their success breeding the kind of overconfidence that led powerful men to believe they were untouchable. Sarah's military experience had taught her that such overconfidence was often the first step toward complete downfall. As word of the confrontation spread beyond the immediate confines of Precision Elite, local media began arriving on the scene. The story was irresistible. An unassuming hospital janitor who'd not only upset the social order by winning an elite shooting competition, but had used the platform to expose corruption at the highest levels of local government. Television crews set up outside the club, while reporters attempted to interview attendees as they left, many of whom declined comment or hurried to their expensive cars without acknowledging the press presence. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm she'd anticipated but hoped to manage carefully. Her military training had included media relations, understanding that public perception could be as important as operational success in achieving strategic objectives. She'd prepared a statement that focused on facts rather than personal accusations, allowing the evidence to speak for itself while positioning her revelations as a matter of civic duty rather than personal vendetta. When Channel 7 news anchor Rebecca Walsh approached her for an on-camera interview, Sarah agreed, knowing that this moment would define how her story was perceived by the broader community. The interview, conducted in the parking lot of Precision Elite, with the club's imposing facade serving as backdrop, would later be described as one of the most compelling pieces of local journalism in recent memory. Mrs. Martinez Walsh began, her professional demeanor masking genuine fascination with the story unfolding before her cameras. "You've just accused two of the most powerful men in our city of serious criminal conduct? That takes remarkable courage. What motivated you to come forward today?" Sarah's response was measured and direct, reflecting the discipline that had characterized her entire approach to this confrontation. "I took an oath when I joined the military to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath didn't expire when I left active service. When I witnessed corruption that undermines the democratic institutions my husband died defending, I had two choices: remain silent and complicit, or speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost." The interview continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Sarah providing careful, factual responses to questions about her evidence, her military background, and her plans moving forward. She refused to engage in personal attacks against Kellerman or Ashworth, instead focusing on the systemic issues their behavior represented. Her measured approach contrasted sharply with the defensive, often angry responses from their representatives who arrived later to provide damage control statements. The story gained national attention within hours, picked up by major news networks who recognized the compelling narrative of an ordinary citizen using extraordinary skills to expose corruption. Social media amplified the reach, with video clips of Sarah's perfect shooting performance and subsequent revelations going viral across multiple platforms. The hashtag number #InvisibleNoMore began trending as people shared their own stories of being underestimated or witnessing corruption in their communities. But the aftermath wasn't uniformly positive for Sarah. Within days of her public accusations, she found herself facing a coordinated campaign of retaliation from the political and business networks that had benefited from the Kellerman-Ashworth partnership. Her employment at the hospital was terminated on questionable grounds, with administrators citing budget constraints, while privately acknowledging pressure from city officials who controlled municipal funding for the public healthcare system. Anonymous threats began appearing in her mailbox and on her phone, messages that stopped just short of explicit violence, while making clear that powerful people were displeased with her actions. The stress was compounded by the financial impact of losing her primary source of income, just as legal expenses began mounting, while her evidence was substantial, proving criminal conduct in court required legal representation that was far beyond her modest means. Several local attorneys declined to take her case, citing potential conflicts of interest or concerns about taking on such politically connected defendants. It seemed that even with compelling evidence, the systems of power that protected men like Kellerman and Ashworth were proving remarkably resilient. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Thomas Brennan, a federal prosecutor who had been investigating corruption in municipal contracting across several states, had seen the news coverage of Sarah's revelations and recognized patterns consistent with cases he was already pursuing. Brennan contacted Sarah through intermediaries, offering the resources of the federal government in exchange for her cooperation in a broader investigation that extended far beyond her local community. The meeting between Sarah and Brennan took place in a secure federal building 3 hours from her hometown, away from the local networks of influence that might compromise the investigation. Brennan a veteran prosecutor with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, listened intently as Sarah walked through her evidence in methodical detail. Her military training had prepared her well for this kind of formal debriefing, and Brennan found himself impressed not just by the quality of her evidence, but by her understanding of the broader implications of what she'd uncovered. "Mrs. Martinez," Brennan said after reviewing her materials for nearly 2 hours, "what you've documented here is just the tip of the iceberg. We've been tracking similar patterns in 17 other cities across 3 states. Your evidence provides crucial missing pieces that could help us understand how these corruption networks operate and spread." He leaned forward, his expression growing more intense. "But I need you to understand what you're getting into. These people have resources, connections, and a willingness to use whatever means necessary to protect themselves. Are you prepared for a fight that could last years and put you in very real danger?" Sarah's response came without hesitation, drawing on reserves of determination that had been tested in far more dangerous circumstances. "Mr. Brennan, I've been fighting powerful enemies my entire adult life. The only difference is that now I'm fighting for something I believe in rather than something I've been ordered to do." The federal investigation that followed Sarah's cooperation was methodical and comprehensive, uncovering a network of corruption that extended far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. Bank records revealed millions of dollars in improper payments, flowing between various business entities and public officials across multiple jurisdictions. Email servers yielded communications that demonstrated coordination between corrupt officials, with Kellerman and Ashworth serving as key nodes in a network that had been operating for over a decade. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated methods these networks used to silence potential whistleblowers. Sarah's experience of losing her job and facing intimidation was part of a playbook that had been used successfully against other potential critics. Previous employees who had attempted to report suspicious activities had found themselves facing coordinated harassment that had effectively destroyed their lives while leaving the corruption intact. As the federal investigation progressed, Sarah found her own situation gradually improving. The publicity around her case had attracted support from veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and ordinary citizens who were inspired by her courage. A legal defense fund raised enough money to cover her expenses and provide financial security while the case proceeded through the courts. Multiple job offers came from organizations that valued her integrity and skills, including several that specifically sought to hire her because of her willingness to speak truth to power. More importantly, her actions had inspired others to come forward with their own evidence of corruption and misconduct. The federal prosecutor's office found itself dealing with a flood of tips and evidence from people who had previously felt powerless to challenge corrupt systems. Sarah's example had demonstrated that ordinary citizens could make a difference when they combined courage with careful preparation and precise execution. The trials of Kellerman and Ashworth became major news events, with Sarah serving as the star witness whose testimony tied together months of investigative work by federal agents. Her appearance on the witness stand was remarkable for its clarity and precision, with defense attorneys finding it impossible to shake her credibility or undermine her evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Kellerman was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, while Ashworth received 15 years plus substantial financial penalties that effectively stripped him of his ill-gotten wealth. But perhaps more importantly, their convictions sent shockwaves through similar corruption networks in other cities, leading to investigations and reforms that had nationwide impact. 3 years after that autumn morning at Precision Elite, Sarah stood before a congressional committee investigating corruption in municipal contracting. Sharing her expertise as someone who had successfully exposed and helped prosecute such networks, she'd become a nationally recognized advocate for government transparency and accountability. Her military precision and uncompromising integrity making her a sought-after speaker and consultant, The transformation from invisible hospital janitor to prominent civil rights advocate would have seemed impossible to anyone who had dismissed her that day at the shooting club. But those who understood military culture would have recognized the progression as entirely natural. Sarah had simply found a new mission worthy of her skills and dedication. The Precision Elite Shooting Club had closed permanently, its reputation too damaged to survive the scandal. The building now housed a community center that offered free programs for veterans and working families, a fitting transformation that Roberto would have appreciated. Sarah often visited the center, sometimes to speak with veterans struggling with their own transitions to civilian life. Other times, simply to remember the day when patience, precision, and moral courage had combined to change everything. The trophy from that long-ago competition sat on her desk in her new office, not as a symbol of victory over opponents in a shooting contest, but as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles were won not through overwhelming force, but through the quiet determination to do what was right regardless of the personal cost. In the end, her perfect shot had done more than hit a distant target. It had pierced through layers of corruption and complacency to reveal the truth that powerful men had tried so hard to hide. And in a world where ordinary people often felt powerless against systemic corruption, Sarah Martinez had proven that sometimes all it takes is one person with the skills, courage, and determination to take that perfect shot when it matters most. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Sarah's new office as she reviewed files from another municipal corruption case, this one involving a small town in Oregon where a whistleblower had followed her example in exposing a network of kickbacks and fraudulent contracts. The parallels were striking. Another ordinary citizen who had been dismissed and underestimated, another set of powerful men who believed their positions made them untouchable. Another community where corruption had festered in the shadows until someone found the courage to shine light into dark corners. Her assistant knocked softly before entering, carrying a stack of letters from citizens across the country who had reached out after seeing her testimony or reading about her work. Each letter told a similar story. Someone who had witnessed corruption or misconduct but felt powerless to act. Someone who needed guidance on how to document evidence properly. Someone who simply wanted to thank her for proving that ordinary people could make a difference. Sarah read each letter personally, responding with specific advice when appropriate, offering encouragement when that was what was needed most. Among today's correspondence was a letter that made her pause. Written in the careful handwriting of someone unaccustomed to formal communication, it came from a janitor at a government building in Iowa who had noticed irregularities in overtime payments and contract awards. The writer described feeling invisible, watching powerful people conduct questionable business while assuming no one was paying attention. The parallels to Sarah's own experience were unmistakable, and she immediately reached for her phone to arrange a secure conversation with this potential new whistleblower. The work was demanding and sometimes dangerous, but it provided the sense of purpose that had been missing from her life since leaving the military. Roberto would have understood her choice to continue fighting. Even though the battlefields were now courtrooms and congressional hearing rooms instead of mountain ranges in Afghanistan, the skills remained remarkably similar: patience, precision, careful observation, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. Most importantly, the mission remained constant, protecting the values and institutions that made democracy possible. That afternoon, Sarah drove to the community center that had replaced Precision Elite, arriving just as a group of young veterans finished their weekly support meeting. She'd established a program that taught practical skills for civilian life, while helping participants understand their rights as citizens and workers. Many of these men and women carried invisible wounds from their service, struggling to find purpose in a world that often seemed indifferent to their sacrifices. The most important thing to remember, she told them as their session concluded, is that your service didn't end when you took off the uniform. The oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies includes the ones who wear expensive suits and hide behind positions of power. Sometimes, the most patriotic thing you can do is refuse to let corruption flourish in the communities you fought to protect. As the veterans filed out, several stopped to thank her personally, sharing their own stories of witnessing misconduct or struggling with moral injury from experiences where they'd been ordered to ignore obvious wrongdoing. Sarah listened to each story with the attention she'd once devoted to intelligence briefings, understanding that these conversations were building a network of informed, motivated citizens who could serve as early warning systems against future corruption. The drive home took her past the cemetery where Roberto was buried, and she stopped, as she did every few weeks, to sit quietly beside his grave. The headstone bore only his name, rank, and dates of service, but Sarah knew the true measure of his legacy lived in the work she continued. She'd kept her promise to never remain silent in the face of injustice. And that promise had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who had found their voices after seeing her example. The dangerous enemy they never saw coming, she whispered to the stone, remembering his words about the power of being underestimated. In a world increasingly divided by political rhetoric and tribal loyalties, Sarah had discovered that the most effective weapon against corruption was often the simple insistence that truth mattered more than power, that ordinary citizens had both the right and responsibility to hold their leaders accountable. As evening approached and she prepared to return home, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path that had led from that humiliating morning at Precision Elite to her current role as a nationally recognized advocate for government accountability. The transformation hadn't been planned or sought, but it had been inevitable once she'd decided to stop hiding her capabilities and start using them for purposes she could believe in completely.